Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy to introduce our next panel, which is part of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Talking Art series. This panel will look at the vision and architecture of the future museum. Speakers include Zaki Nusayba, Presidential Advisor and Board Member of TCA Abu Dhabi. Frank Geary, architect, and Richard Armstrong, director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Foundation. The panel will be moderated by Vishakha Desai, President Emerita of Asia Society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I'm Vishakha Desai, and indeed I have the pleasure of being here with very, very distinguished panelists, none of whom needs an introduction. You already heard we are a little late, so I'm not going to go into an elaborate discussion about the distinguished careers of our panelists, and we'll get right into the conversation itself. Let me also just say that rather than any kind of set presentation, this particular discussion is very much a discussion among our panelists, and we will also open it up to all of you for your questions towards the end of the discussion. So I'm going to really begin with Frank Geary, partly because I think that the Guggenheim project, right as it began, although in the late 20th century, is very much a 21st century project. And when we think about 21st century museums, the definition of museums are quite different, it seems to me, than where we might have been in the past. So Frank, if you could tell us a little bit about your initial involvement, your initial hesitation even, and then how you came about creating the kind of design that you now have. And what we have is a few images just to actually ground our discussion. So Frank.
Well, I had done worked on the Bilbao Museum with Tom Krenz and Juan Ignacio Vidarte. And I was approached about this project, and I resisted it because I thought, well, it's a culture that I'm not familiar with. It's far away. I was feeling old at the time. I got younger since. And I thought it would be the commitment and everything because I get very involved with my clients. I grow the buildings from inside them and myself as we collaborate. And so Abu Dhabi seemed more insular at the time, seemed like it would be hard to make that kind of connections I wanted to make. And so I resisted the project until I realized that the scale of it and the mission of it for the world, I believe art is the way to bring people together of different cultures. I'm very involved with the Divan Orchestra with Barenboim, and that was created with Edward Said. And I see the Israelis and Palestinians playing Mozart together. They may not like each other when they leave the concert hall, but at least there's a chance of this discussion that feels very positive through the art. And when I realized that this had that kind of mission and possibility, because the globalization of art is so amazing, and as you see in the art fair here, it's beyond belief, the works from all over the Middle East and other countries. And so the thought of being able to be part of that became very enticing to me. When I finally met the people and got involved, I work in models, so I made 20 or 30 models, and we went through the budget control of the models, what each one cost, And one of the models, I was trying to think of a way to cool the outdoor public spaces, because when I was here, I noticed people like to be outside under trellises and things. And so we made these like teepees and put them on the model over the public spaces. And they happened to be with blue paper by accident. And when the clients came to see the models, they said, "How did you do that? That's really exciting." So, next. So I was trying to figure out why that connected, and then I realized if you look at Hagia Sophia and many of the mosques, they have this kind of a conglomeration of separate pieces like this. And I realized that there was the beginning of an understanding language in the region, and then I built on that. Next. And we went a long way with that.
So it seems to me that, Richard, you came into the picture after the vision was already kind of evolved in some ways. And as the new director, relatively new director, you have infused the idea of the 21st Century Museum in a different way through other kinds of ways. So can you talk a little bit about your own sense of this notion of a creation of a new museum, a 21st Century Museum in this region, and what it means for the Guggenheim coming out of New York?
Well, not only was it new for me to be in Abu Dhabi, it was new for me to be in New York as well. So I really didn't know the Guggenheim, and I certainly didn't know Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. But in the intervening 4 years, one thing I've discovered that I think is historically applicable is that in the Guggenheim at its inception in New York in the 1930s and early 1940s, the museum had a radical mission, which was that by looking at abstract art, this was the conviction of the founders, that we could change or modify or improve human behavior. This is a fairly radical idea. Now I see 4 years later, and I think Frank Lloyd Wright's building is complementary to that ambition. Now I see 4 years later that in an evolving idea of a 21st century museum in Abu Dhabi, we can turn to Frank Gehry in a comparable way to Frank Lloyd Wright and use those early radical ideas of the founders of the Guggenheim in New York to say that here's a museum that could have the same aspiration, which would be to help change, modify, improve, and certainly expand people's behavior. And we expect a very big attendance, much bigger than New York. So ultimately and statistically, I think we might be affecting more people. But the short answer to that would be that I knew Frank from afar. I knew the building not at all. Of course, I knew Tom Krenz. I didn't know Abu Dhabi. Now that I know all of those elements together, I feel even more optimistic about the possibilities of the institution.
I think one of the things that you're talking about is this kind of forward-looking nature of the foundation of Guggenheim at the very beginning with Frank Lloyd Wright. And in a way, this is the next frontier that one wants to really think about. And it seems to me, Zaki, that that notion of forward-looking institution building seems to be a very big part of where Abu Dhabi comes in. So can you tell us a little bit about what was the inspiration? But particularly I'm interested in your vision, Abu Dhabi's vision of this new kind of a museum, because this is not about bringing just collections from somewhere else. It's also about building a new collection here. So tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, from the Abu Dhabi's perspective, of this idea.
You know, the building of this museum is a central plank with the other museums and the cultural department around it, and with everything else that is happening in Abu Dhabi. They are all central planks of Abu Dhabi vision of how to face the challenges of the 21st century. Now, I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember, but 40 years ago, this island was a barren strip of sand. People came out here for weekends from a barren strip of sand that was Abu Dhabi capital in order to swim and to fish. The last 40 years were taken up in trying to build the foundations of a modern state, amongst a lot of skepticism, because many people then, if you read what was being discussed in the international press in the 60s and 70s, doubted the very fact that the federal experiment is going to succeed in the area. Of course it did, as we all know, and by the end of the 20th century, the Emirates had become a powerful economic and political center in this region, working for stability and progress and providing prosperity for their own people. Now, a central plank of the next phase of development, if you like, was to develop this region and this island in particular as a cultural hub. Very few people know that even in the first stage, as Sheikh Zayed was developing his state, his modern state, one of the earliest projects was to build a national museum in Al Ain in order to put, and that was in 1969, before we even had the basic infrastructures of roads and harbors and airports. And the idea was to bring rock art from Bronze Age that was found in the tombs of Hili and Nar, and to show his people that while we develop and build the new, we belong very much to a tradition and to a historic past and to a heritage that is very important for our identity. And the same two driving forces, if you like, remain constant with this new stage of development, which is the wealth of the nation is not in its mineral resources, it's not in oil and money. That is a central plank, but that it is in its own people, and therefore we need to do everything we can in order to educate and train them, and in order to make them capable of facing the challenges of the 21st century. The second plank, and that is something that ties to what Richard and Frank were saying earlier, is the conviction that Abu Dhabi itself is part of a universal narrative, that we do not exist as a small nation on our own, but we are part of a human history, that we need to open bridges to the rest of the world through this long-term development policies for our future. And this is why we do have these museums of the future. There are museums to build our own people. There are museums in order to educate and train them, but there are museums also to open bridges with the rest of the world and to link with the narrative of Richard and Frank. And they are also museums that can show us what we can contribute to the general development of arts and cultures internationally, not only locally. And the last point I would make is that the museums and the development of arts is only one part of an overall strategy within Abu Dhabi's 2030 vision that also looks at the economic side, at the political side, at the security side, at the defense side of how we can make sure that the Emirates can face the challenges of the 21st century.
Frank, you wanted to add to Zaki's comment.
I did. For reasons we don't know, good reasons, the gods have shone their light on this region and provided the resources that are extraordinary, and the leadership has decided to use those resources to make a statement, world statement, on many levels, as Zaki said, but in the arts, beyond belief of what anybody in the world right now could imagine, is to bring together the artists from all over the world who are in incredible productive period, artists from Africa, from everywhere, and talk to each other. They're talking to each other anyway. The artists, you can see in the art fair, the Middle Eastern artists are aware of art history, are aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. They are talking to each other, and it's so beautiful. It's represented in this art fair, and it's just the beginning. It's so much bigger even than that, and this is an opportunity to show that in this place because of the miracle of this time, and the fact that the leadership is supporting that and making that happen is mind-boggling, and I'm so happy to be part of it.
I do think that in many places, often people talk about how you first need the economic development, then we'll do education, then when we have the time, we'll get to the cultural. But that you're actually doing it right at the heart of development of a society is a rather unique thing. And coming out of the Asian side of things, I think often that's something people forget. So it's something that really we have to think about as we keep going into the 21st century, the role of arts and culture at the very heart of civilizational development as we go forward. And I think that brings me, Richard, to the next question, that when we think about museums, we think about them as really 18th century and 19th century product of Western notion of museums. And for so much of the 20th century, museums were about collecting and then preserving things from sometimes other parts of the world, often as kind of imperial loot, if you will, in some parts of the Western world. Those of us who come out of Asia are very sensitive to those parts of questions. But it seems to me that compared to a number of other institutions who are going to be here, that the Guggenheim is developing in an approach which is going to be about building a collection, because museums are as much about people, ideas, places. And you're really thinking about this new kind of way of thinking about collection that actually can open up the discussion and the narrative of modern and contemporary art, which has been so much for most of 20th century seen as a kind of a Western narrative in which other things fit in. So tell us a little bit about the acquisition philosophy of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and how you're trying to open that up.
Well, let me go back to my earlier point, which was the Guggenheim at its inception was extremely oriented to German art and has many, many examples of paintings and drawings by Kandinsky, for example. And if you wanted to be simplistic, which I sometimes am almost every day, you could say the Museum of Modern Art was the center for French art, the Guggenheim was the center for German art, the Whitney Museum was the center for American art. What's interesting in all three of those New York-based institutions is the erosion of their boundaries. They've become more interesting because they've become more oriented to a bigger world. And it's been a very gradual process. Each of those institutions is barely 75 years old. So here we have a very large challenge. Not only do we have a building that's quite big and has very capacious galleries, which is good because contemporary art tends to be frequently quite large, but also we have the possibility of making a different story. We don't have to say that Picasso, Matisse, etc., Kandinsky are the founders and the DNA of everything that we admire. So with the curators, we began a discussion that said, how could the collection be more ambitious and in some ways also more intellectually nimble and more flexible and certainly more inclusive? Ultimately, the idea became to acquire work that in the question of Western modernism would be seen after the 1960s. We all agree that historically this is the moment when there's a rupture from the 19th century into the time that we know today. Some people call it postmodernism, we call it whatever we care to. So I'm showing you a few things that we were able to acquire over the last 4 years. Then more recently, we've discovered that the core collection, which will be much more finely attuned to the achievements of the Middle East, needs to begin at an earlier moment. So that collection will be from the 40s essentially onwards, arguing that in the vacuum of post-colonialism, many beautiful things emerged. And we'll see examples of that in the collection. So these are a few images of what's been able to be brought into the collection. There are in approximately 100 objects now. We meet with counterparts from Abu Dhabi. We have 4 experts, we think they're experts, that we're familiar with and admire, and together, using the wisdom of the curators and our counterparts here in Abu Dhabi, try to assemble a collection that we think will be several things. We have to understand that it needs to be tremendously legible, because we're dealing with audiences that are not always familiar with the intricacies of museum going. We need also to have an experience that's memorable, because one of the successes of the Guggenheim in New York and Venice and in Bilbao is you can remember what you saw there. This is the advantage of distinctive architecture. So we're interested in making memorable experiences. And finally, we think that collectively we can assert that it will be a collection of unusual quality also, because in the long term, only the very best and richest and most ambitious things survive, and that's our opportunity. I must say, editorially, that for the New York and European team, it's offered us a very different way of looking at our own history. So what we thought that we knew so well turns out to be only a fraction of what's been achieved in this century. And by being deeply involved with Abu Dhabi and the Middle East and the aspiration of being a transnational museum that is looking at great evidence from around the world, the New York team in particular has discovered that it's a much, much bigger, richer and more interesting world than we once knew. So for that, it's been a great privilege.
Well, I must say that at least from afar as well as near, one of the things that those of us who have been working with non-Western side of things often used to be told by our New York curator friends, not so much the Guggenheim, that if I hadn't seen it in New York, it couldn't exist. Or if I hadn't actually recognized it, it couldn't be any good. And that notion that New York is the center of the universe, I'm glad to hear is beginning to get broken apart a bit. And I think that's an important kind of a contribution that Abu Dhabi project can make onto the New York scene. It's an important kind of a reversal. And Zaki, I know that this issue of being global and regional and local is very much on your mind, as much as Frank was talking about how this can be sensitive to the location. Tell us a bit about the challenge of doing that, especially because most people assume when you partner with Guggenheim is that it was basically an importation of New York Guggenheim into here. But clearly that's not where the collection is going and how you're developing this.
You know, I'm very glad you asked that question, and in fact, you should come and join our next panel when we discuss about art centers in the world. Is it New York, and could it be somewhere else? But I'm also glad because you raised an earlier issue, which is that the public museum, as we know it today, is a Western concept, and we say this. It was with the development. It was developed as the nation-state trophy. And this is, of course, true to an extent, but we forget that the fact collecting art and the display of art is quite an ancient tradition. It goes back perhaps to the library in Alexandria in 280 BC. And we forget that within the Islamic world and within this region, there has always been an interest in collecting, display, different kinds of art. So that is one issue. I think the points that were raised both by Frank and Richard, the idea that art is a radical force that can change societies, that can create social capital, may have seemed radical in the 30s, but it was very much part of the vision of the founding fathers of Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates. And it was interesting in a conversation we were having yesterday with Anish Kapoor. He was saying that our culture and tradition was more related to text and words. And today we are discovering that also a strong part of it is related to the fine arts, the drawings and paintings and sculptures and other expressions. And all of this is coming together in the development of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which I was personally very moved by hearing Richard say yesterday that by looking at transnational museum art, as he called it, he suddenly became to realize that there is a much more complicated link between the arts of the different regions of the world and that they can all affect each other. For me personally, this is the last point I want to make, what really moved me was to see how much contemporary art is meaningful in the life of the United Arab Emirates, its people, its young people. I mean, when you think that somebody like Hassan Sharif has been creating cutting-edge contemporary art back in the 80s, and there is a whole narrative that I hope one day the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi would be able to show where he started and how he meticulously developed this. And then you look at our young artists, local, of course, who are working now with this medium in order to express themselves, but also regional. If you think that some of the brightest Iranian artists, Indian artists, I mean Iranian, the Mushiri, the Harizada brothers, Indian artists, even Chinese artists, people from around the globe are coming together in order to be part of this developing cultural, not project or narrative that is happening in Abu Dhabi and in the United Arab Emirates, because I must add, it's not just Abu Dhabi. I mean, we are talking about a movement that is spread throughout the region with Sharjah and its 18 museums and Biennale, and Dubai and its 90 galleries, and Qatar and its museums. We are witnessing something I believe that is very important. I believe it is something that is saying something useful to the region, because we live in a very turbulent political and social region, and it's good to have a model, a social, political, cultural model that works, and that tells our young peoples here in the region around us in the Arab world, but also in the region around us from the other nationalities. We have more than 150 nationalities living in the Emirates, working. It's important to show them a model that works. And this is what, to me personally, has been the most pleasurable part of seeing this project develop here.
Well, Frank, clearly this is something that you've been thinking about for a long time. You've been thinking about this project for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about how working on this project has actually changed what you might have thought about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and how you think about it going forward as you begin to think about its implementation?
Well, nobody's talked about this yet, but the most obvious thing is the internet. And I don't know what I'm talking about. I can't turn the computer on myself, but...
But you know it's important.
Well, we are involved, but the power of it, you can't hold back this expanded universe of transfer of information. I mean, a friend of mine who took a box of tablets, he made these tablets for school children, a computer that are selling for $100, and he took a box of them with a contraption for solar energy, and put the box in the middle of a town in Ethiopia where the culture has no written language. There's no symbols, no written language. And he left it in the middle of the street. And 4 days later, he came back, and the kids had learned to turn it on and use the photovoltaics. And then 6 weeks later, they hacked the system. You can't hold us back. This thing is, and so that's what's, for me, very exciting. Once I realized this was a potential to address that kind of communication worldwide, and I mean, it's mind-boggling. I think the Guggenheim is a wonderful museum in New York. This is going to be a totally different Guggenheim. It's a totally different museum, as Richard knows, and it's going to be very, very important, I think.
As we go forward.
We don't want them to be too unalike, because one of the benefits from our side is that we've learned that the collection in New York is too parochial. So we're hoping that we can expand the New York collection to also present new kinds of information. Yeah, we have to.
No choice, no choice. I think that's one of the things that when you're talking about the modern being a French or Guggenheim being a German and the Whitney being the American, that essentially it was still a Euro-American enterprise. And that no longer is an option. And I think that's to some extent one has to sort of think about. But it does get the question of, we all think about the benefits of transcultural and the global, which is a connectivity. But there also could be, in fact, learning pains, how we actually make this enterprise work, what are the kind of tensions that come up. So one of the questions that I would have, especially Zaki, let's start with you, is the fact that here is this collaboration. You are involved with other institutions as well from Europe. What are the ways, especially when it comes to software? And what I mean by that is that often we hear that in many, many emerging economies, people are very focused on the buildings. But when it comes to running them, to actually create the kind of human software, that's where sometimes the issues come up. So the cultural differences still remain something we have to deal with as we go forward. Can you talk a little bit about how, from Abu Dhabi perspective, you're looking at that issue of interchange, where cultural nuances and specificity can come in the way of creating a successful collaborative model?
Well, the driving force behind all of this long-term development strategy for Abu Dhabi and within the Emirates, as I have said, is the need to focus on our people as the real wealth of the nation. And as a result, before the first stone of the first museum, before the first piling for the first institution, cultural institution has started, there was, of course, a focus on what does it mean to our young people? How can we train them in order to be an active participator, but also manager of this enterprise? And that is one of the reasons why we are so fortunate. I mean, Frank very kindly said the leadership here had the vision, the resources, and the will to use these resources in order to implement a vision which is truly far-sighted and looks at the interests of their own people. And this is why we have these very, for us, successful and enriching partnerships. In Abu Dhabi has sought in every endeavor it attempted, whether it was in the economic field, the defense field, security, education, and culture, to bring on board partners that we are proud to have with us, because they can bring the expertise, the experiences that can help us develop this software that you were mentioning. Now, part of the preparation for this new phase of economic and cultural development is the training of young Emiratis. Young Emiratis through the schools, bringing art and culture, education into the schools, but also having partnerships with the universities, whether it is the Sorbonne University and the École de Louvre, that together have an art management and art history programs, or the New York University, or the Zayed University, and the other universities. So in the long term, what we hope that will be achieved is to bring our young people to the level where they can have this fruitful exchange. As I said, an exchange that is based on our own identity, because it's very easy as you develop into the modern world to have this identity undermined or weakened. So based on our own identity, and this is part of the projects that go with archaeology and the preservation of our literature and poetry and writing traditions, but also open to the world, so that the transnational museums that the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will, the Universal Museum that the Louvre is going to be, the National Museum of Sheikh Zayed, all of these museums together can bring our young people to both be proud and aware of their cultural, historic heritage, but also to be open to the cultures of the world without diminishing the fact that there will be sometimes, there are shared values and there are values that are put us at some difference, and we need to be able to look at all those and to be able to work them together.
It seems to me, Frank, you've had some architects and trainees who have come from here, work in your office. What are the things that they found most surprising working with you?
I don't know. What I found surprising is how willing and ready they were to even, I saw a sense of leadership beginning with these two young ladies that came, and we would like you to send us more because they're ready. You're not going to stop this. It's just, I mean, it's just exciting that you're willing to, and that there's the resources and willing to let this happen. And it's just like it's watering the plants and let them grow, because these kids have open minds. They've been exposed to, as I said, the internet, and I don't know what else you call it, the cloud, or what do you call it, that they've been exposed to. But they know everything. You know, they've watched The Simpsons. I was on The Simpsons. They've even seen that. So it's out there, and you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen. And the positive effect it can have on the rest of the world understanding this region is extraordinarily important. I mean, it's art is the truth, as I said earlier, and you can't, you know, it's real, and it's filled with love, and it's out there, and it's going to happen.
Well, Richard, it sounds like everything is going just so beautifully, no problems. So I want you to talk about what is the most difficult part of this kind of collaboration that truly is intercultural, and what has it been in terms of learning experience, in addition to the intellectual learning experience for your team, but that's been an important part of this experience?
It's the same, I think, when you bring together professionals from different backgrounds, different parts of the world, their devotion to the perfection that they know empirically frequently clashes. So no matter what the object or the appreciation of it is, or the scholarship, these are highly devoted people to the information and experience they've had. They may or may not be so familiar with the unfamiliar, and therefore I think it's in that ambiguous zone that people become mistrustful or disconnected, or they feel that there's arbitrary decisions being made by one party or the other. What's, I think, charming is that as ambiguities and unfamiliarities melt away, discerning people turn out to be very alike, and therefore there is a consensus about what's worth really devoting energy and time to. If there's a universality in the world, it might be that quest for beauty.
Well, I do think that arts have this capacity, amazingly, to transcend cultures and places, but also to represent a place. That it's both about cultural specificity and universality. And how do we harness that when you create a project like the Abu Dhabi Guggenheim. I think it's an important issue. So it brings me to one of the last questions, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you, and that is, the museum is about to open, let's say. What is your biggest wish, and what is your worst nightmare? So let's start with the nightmare first, and then we'll stand with the more optimistic scenario of your biggest
I'll
wish.
start with the nightmare
Right.
part, because we just had a hurricane in New York. So we wouldn't want a big sandstorm, or we wouldn't want any kind of natural disaster, because for us, it's difficult to understand how to respond to that. And we're not even good with hurricanes, let alone sandstorms. Our biggest wish, I think, would be that, well, my biggest wish personally, even in every museum I've been involved with, is that no matter who it is, if the person is inquisitive, he or she feels at home. So that I think if we had that ambition, that opens the doors very broadly.
Exciting, exactly.
My biggest nightmare is the fact that, as I said earlier, we live in a very turbulent region, and we are surrounded by many tensions and confrontations. And what the cultural and development strategy of Abu Dhabi and the Emirates is trying to do is to bring people closer to each other through these projects, to open cultures to each other, and to bring love, as Frank said, that is in the process of creation, like has happened before, whether it was in the Andalus of the 8th and 9th and 10th century, or in Baghdad under the Abbasids, the golden age of civilizations that brought everyone together, the Jewish thinkers, the Christian thinkers, the Muslim thinkers, in order to create one universal community that incidentally was at the root convictions of the founding father of the Emirates, Sheikh Zayed. So the biggest nightmare really is that this region, which is very turbulent, which needs this message that Abu Dhabi is trying to bring about of working together, opening cultures to each other, and maintaining our own heritage. The biggest nightmare is that something should go wrong regionally and then affect what we are doing here. And this is always on everybody's mind.
It seems to me that it bears remembering that arts have capacity to unite, but arts also have a capacity to create clashes in a big way, whether it's literature or the visual art.
But the art and culture that Abu Dhabi is putting into its narrative is not one of confrontation. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's one of trying to bring the differences together in the way that Barenboim has brought these orchestras together in order to play a symphony for peace and love. So this is the biggest nightmare. And the project contains this message. The project contains this message. My biggest wish, what I wish to see, is that once the museum opens, and it's the museums of tomorrow, that we will have all the young people make use of it, that it will be open to the cultures of not only our own people, but also the regional populations around us, that it would be truly, the biggest wish is that it would be truly a crossroads between cultures, civilizations, and this is at the heart, as I said, of the founding father's vision for the development of his country.
Well, I must say the fact that, in fact, UAE sits at the cultural crossroads, and that the Abu Dhabi Guggenheim is as much involved with the region as it's also with the East-West connection and those collections that are built from China as well. So, Frank.
Well, my greatest hope is that that the meetings and sessions I've had with the leadership and the involving design with the Guggenheim and them is that this building shows the respect we have for this culture, that the building is of this place and culture, and that it's not a building that would be built anywhere else that would look anything like this anywhere else in the world. And I hope that's what happens.
Thank you. We're going to open up for questions. And what I would love to do is that if you would identify yourself and try to keep it as a question rather than a long comment so that we can get as many of you as possible in the discussion. And I think there are microphones on both sides. So there is a hand back there.
Hi, my name is Tahira. This is to all the panel. I was just wondering if you were worried about competition from the likes of Qatar, or whether it will build a Middle Eastern cultural hub. Do you see yourselves in competition or as part of a bigger whole?
I can answer that. I think the more the merrier. So I think it's happy for us that it's a shared ambition. It's located in many places. It's not so horrible, for example, when you go to Paris and there happen to be 81 museums. And I think that if you're interested in high culture, it's always better rather than not to have lots of complementary activity. So I think we feel no competition, but we feel a kind of shared ambition for presenting the best of contemporary culture.
So since I'm not doing anything in this region other than this building, I am competitive, and ours is going to be the best.
And I believe that what is happening in Qatar, but also around us in Sharjah and in Dubai, and what is happening further afield in Bombay and in Peking and in Korea and everywhere, is an added strength to the cultural project for this region, because this is a project that needs to work within a wider region. So we are very happy to see those developments in all the countries around us.
Well, you know, sometimes in New York we say that if there are 5 Chinese restaurants or 5 Indian restaurants in East Village, they all do better, because in fact the competition is good and ultimately quality gets better. So just think about it as restaurant row, cultural row, right? So absolutely. Hand right there. It's a gentleman.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about something that all of
Can you also identify if you have any affiliations so we have a good sense of who you are?
Any affiliation? I'm working for a German architecture firm in Doha.
Okay.
And yeah, we're interested in historic buildings. And excuse me. You all said something about buildings having the capacity to change and modify behavior. And I just wanted to ask a question about where you could see that going and where this progress is going, and also about the ability of this building to reflect Emirati heritage, and specifically how that kind of relates to the aesthetic and the design process that went on there.
It's for you, Frankie.
Well, I thought I showed you that. That I spent time here with the clients. I observed the way people act and live as best I could. I've shown many models to them, and there were opportunities. It was like a way of creating a language that the clients could understand so they could get involved with me. So it wasn't just I came in and handed them a thing and said, look what I did. It was a buildup of understanding over quite a long period of time, and through a lot of modeling and discussion. And I was very keen on having the stakeholders here be willing to take ownership in the design. So it wasn't just something they were going to either approve or not approve. They're part of it. I would never have done a building with blue cones like that. I can't imagine ever doing it anywhere else. And it just was something that, and I was shocked in the beginning when they liked it so much that this. So it was a give and take language over time, and working through the hardships of their their time schedules and their budgets and their cultural differences in the way they approach work and build and so on. So I think it's interlaced with them. Now, I'm not an expert on whether it's culturally relevant. That's what I was saying. I hope when it's done, the vote will be yay, that it did have that kind of. As far as museumology, how do you build a museum for contemporary art? That's something I do know about, and probably know more about it than they did. But we had the Guggenheim, we have curators, we have directors. I've worked with them before. We've tested things over time in Bilbao, in the Frank Lloyd Wright building, in other exhibits that they've done. And I know many of the artists on the western side of the world personally. I've grown up with them, known over the years with a lot of them, and worked with many of them. So that part, and we've done successful galleries and all that stuff. That part, I think, is okay. I think that the cultural thing, as you refer, that's the test. I really believe in the end, it'll either be something that is relevant, and I hope it is. And so far I feel that there's been plenty of time to look at those models, and we've made models that are huge, would fill this whole stage. You can climb in them and see the spaces, and everybody's done that. And we've mounted shows in the models, and so there's a lot of knowledge. It's not just that you come in with a thing and hand it to them. I've never done that personally, so it's something that evolved over a long period. And there's still time. If anybody has any kind of misgivings about any parts of this, there is open discussion always in the way I work.
But part of it, Frank, is also how the building is going to be ultimately used.
Yes.
Right, and that's not until it's used can you tell that, right?
Right, but it's very open-ended. It has a variety of galleries and heights and sizes and organizations, horizontally, vertically. So
Yeah, and Richard, I think you want to talk a
pretty
little bit about...
sophisticated,
Yeah.
the way it's been.
I just want to say one thing about the word relevant. Really can be a bit of a trap. And what's, I think, better for us to think of is, do we have the courage to go forward into a new set of spaces? I remember when I first went to Bilbao, and when it's under construction, I was confused and in some ways disaffected by the building. And I went back after it opened, and I still felt somewhat alienated from the building, thinking that it was too big or that it might be hostile to art. But now, 20 years later, it seems so normal and also so hospitable and encouraging. So I think we have to be courageous enough to say, let's go beyond relevancy and think about what could be inspirational. Believe me, when Frank Lloyd Wright opened that building on Fifth Avenue in 1959, it was not considered a normal thing, and it was very heavily criticized. But we see today that it's a building that allows for growth, change, and new opportunity for artists. So relevant is a certain kind of word. It may not be the word that we should adhere to most closely.
And I would like to add that also relevant may not be the right word when we discuss the cultural dimension of any new building or any new installation we have, because we do not want to fall into the trap of thinking that preserving our heritage and traditions means that we need to go on repeating ad infinitum the same patterns that were done under the Umayyads or the Abbasids. If we discuss mosques, I mean, I think it is useful to always be on the lookout while being proud of our heritage and always seeking a kind of relation, a link to this heritage, but also have this heritage not a fossilized form of patterns that we continue to repeat all the time, but try to also find new expression. So I think what Frank here did was something that is outstanding in this domain.
Well, I think part of it is this notion of being somewhat nostalgic about the past, which is one trap you can fall into if you think about relevance. On the other hand, if it is completely imposed and it is not lived, that's another kind of relevance. And then the third one is, especially for the Guggenheim, because you're trying to really move forward into the contemporary life, then it's about another kind of an equation that I think is as important, which is to go forward. That word seems relevant today, I guess. Another question. The hand right there, and then we'll come in the front, yes. Yes, let's wait for the mic.
Mr. Giri, very quick question. Gaudi created a language in his time of architecture that created a cul-de-sac. Basically, nobody could follow him, and nobody's followed.
Who did you say?
Gaudi.
Gaudi.
And his architecture, nobody followed him. He created a cul-de-sac. You have a very unique form of architecture. It is astonishingly unique. Do you think that you have created another cul-de-sac? Do you see anybody in the future trying to do architecture the same way that you have approached it? My name is Din Kalachin. I'm sorry, I should have said that, and I'm an architect.
Well, which buildings are you talking about of mine?
Gaudi, all of his buildings.
Of
residential-
mine.
Oh, your buildings, yes, your architect.
Do you know all of them?
Well, I know.
But they don't all look the same.
That's
So,
I think
No, but I mean.
so I don't think.
You are known for.
But that's the press does that.
Okay, so shall I talk to the press then?
Talk to the press.
But seriously, do you think that anybody is going to follow this form of architecture?
Sure, there's lots of people out there doing their own work. No, it's very personal, so I don't try to worry about that. It's not something I think about or conscious about. You know, you're just one person doing stuff.
So you're not worried about your legacy for other people?
I'm more excited about
What you're
tomorrow,
doing, right.
today, you know.
Thank you. You had a hand. Please come forward. There's one more. And then we'll go back. There's a, yes, we'll come back to you. You had a hand up, yes. Please wait for the microphone.
My name is Rita Janssen. We are EU diplomats living in Cairo. I have a question for Mr. Nuseimi. There will be two major museums next to each other, three, yes, like Jared, but the Louvre and the Guggenheim. Will these museums each have their own identity? Are they working together on what each of them will be? And when is the opening schedule for both museums?
I mean, absolutely. The three museums that are under construction now, and there could be further museums for the future, but they are working together in synergy with the meeting, because they are all being developed by the Tourism and Culture Authority in Abu Dhabi, so they are all working together. The third one being the National Museum of Sheikh Zayed. So they are working in synergy, and each museum will have its own identity, but obviously the fact that they are together within one cultural district means that they can also work with each other in order to enrich their programs and organize their events. About the timing for the opening of the museums, they have been announced already, with the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, as the first museum to be opened, 2015, 16 for the National Museum of Abu Dhabi, 17 for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So these are the dates that have been given, and the building is going ahead with these museums. Guggenheim, we hope for the final quarter of 2017.
I can add on the collection question, the Louvre goes until the 1960s in its collecting. So it's not as
65.
if there won't be a gap in the 20th century where two collections don't join up. They do join up consciously.
There's a hand, yeah, there are two hands back there. Yes.
Yes. One question regarding the collection. How does the Guggenheim or the cultural district plan to deal with the cultural restrictions in the region and censorship, and what to exhibit and what not to exhibit?
Well, we haven't experienced any restrictions. We've had a consciousness of sensitivities. So we're trying to be sensitive to cultural norms of the area, but we haven't been told, if this is your question, don't do this. There hasn't been that discussion.
Yes, please.
Good evening. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Sausan Al-Manhali. I was a previous intern in Gary Partners, like before 2 years.
Oh.
And now I'm a current employee in TDIC. First of all, I want to welcome all of you in Abu Dhabi. And I want to say to all of people that the Guggenheim will be the best, since I have experienced that before with Gary. And each corner of this museum will have like a story about the architecture from our traditions too. And I hope all the best for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I promise you we didn't plant her. She just did it herself. Richard, I actually, as she was talking about every corner, I wonder if you could say a word about kind of organization of the museum, if you could share some of the ideas you have.
Well, it's an evolving idea. So the notion would be that in each of the 5 principal galleries on the first floor, one would see a kind of complete story around issues such as abstraction since the mid-1960s, or different visions of memory and history since 1960. But rather than present a strictly chronological, stylistic, taxonometric view of contemporary art, if such a thing can happen, instead it's meant to immerse you into a kind of story that gives evidence from every part of the world, so that if I only have the endurance to go to one of the galleries, I come out fully satisfied in having seen information around that set of subjects. And because of the way Frank designed the building, there are many places to go outside and decompress. So I can go outside, I can see the water, I can see the horizon. We hope that we'll have also art objects that sometimes exist outside. And it's meant to be a non-pressurized view of achievement after the 1960s that your average aunt and uncle from downtown Dusseldorf or wherever feel great pleasure in coming to visit, and that they remember as a very distinct experience, but not a rigid march through contemporary art history.
And I think the question that you will mix and match representations from many different cultures in each theme,
yeah.
I think is very important.
Yeah, well, I think what we've discovered, and everyone knows this in going to museums, it looks from the outside as if someone's interested in preserving things. But that's implicit inside being cultured. What isn't so implicit is, do you encourage imagination? And really what our aspiration is to encourage imagination.
And I think also for people it might be interesting, both Zaki and Richard, to talk a little bit about the fact that you're really trying to create a museum of the future, which is not just about to reflect the marketplace of today.
Exactly. The future is a very ambiguous place, but let's say that we want to have a flexible institution that can accommodate many different kinds of achievement. And also, I think it's useful that the museum be seen as a real site of inquisition, of discussion, yes, of research and learning, but it's so important to have that civil dialogue. And this is a place where it's very easy to make sure that there's plenty of civil dialogue.
And also a fun place to come to. I mean, all of this, but also a place where people truly come, like all the multifunction museums of today, starting with the Centre Pompidou and onwards, but looking also into the future with all what the internet is going to provide, with the virtual knowledge that is available on the cloud. And finally, a place that can create what we know as social capital. People come together from all communities, from all cultures, and they all feel part of these great museums.
Thank you. A hand right there, and then we'll go back. And it's a third question. We'll come back to you. Yes.
My name is Mohammed Al-Jabouri. I'm an architecture student in the American University of Sharjah. Thank you. In conjunction with the point that was raised a while ago about the willingness of people in this region to kind of preserve the architectural look, the nostalgia for the past, architectural revivalism, I wanted to ask, I mean, other than the way you set up the spaces in the museum, how you were saying there was a conglomeration of spaces that was borrowed from Hagia Sophia or mosques of the Ottoman time, what else can one do to sort of preserve this or revive the past? Could one go about it in terms of typology, materiality? How can we push it further?
Well, you got it wrong. What I was saying, I wasn't inspired by the mosque. I was working intuitively with my sense of the region and my sense of the people and my sense of the project, and then they liked it. They liked what I was doing. These people that I had not met before, whose culture was so different, I somehow connected to them in this period after, I think it was after eight months or so of meetings. So we had some knowledge of each other. And then I was trying to figure out why they liked it, and I realized that this culture is used to buildings with multiple shade, like domes, and I went and started looking at the mosques and realized that that's why that picture of Haga, it came after the fact. I wasn't emulating it consciously in any way. I felt like it was sort of a check for me that there was something going on. I think that the relationship, it's something that's in your gut, in your heart, in your soul, that, the building techniques and so on are pretty universal, and the materials and images. I think it's a matter of immersing in the culture and in the images that are part of this culture, and respecting them and not consciously copying or emulating or anything. I would never do that. If you think I'm doing that, stop me.
Thank you. Yes, the hand there, and then we'll go. There is another hand there. I'm sorry. Yes, the gentleman standing there, and then we'll come back to you on this side.
Thank you. My name is Sean from 7 Days newspaper. Welcome to you all. I want to return to something that Richard said earlier, that you haven't been stopped from presenting any art at the museum, but we as journalists and artists, everybody here in this country knows perfectly well that as soon as you step out of line, you will be stopped. So there is an enormous amount of self-censorship in this country, even about the conditions of workers here working in Saadiyat Island. And I'm wondering how the museum can get beyond that, and how you can have any art that says anything relevant about the UAE without being censored, because you might not be stopped now, but if anybody was to make a direct criticism of the leaders of this country, they would be immediately stopped. We all know that. I'd like the panel to address that. Thank you.
Well, I can say about the condition of the workers on Saadiyat Island, as you know, we had a big resistance from artists, particularly European and American artists, who signed a boycott against the Guggenheim around the world, saying that they were unable to sell their work until worker conditions changed. That was about 2 years ago. And in the intervening time, we feel that there have been demonstrable changes in the condition of these workers, and we have proof through audits by Price Waterhouse. I imagine, I can only imagine that we'll have, we think, any kind of comparable disagreements in the future will offer an opportunity for other kinds of resolutions as well. But I don't live my life thinking about the disasters that are yet to come.
Zaki?
Well, the fact about the labor conditions, of course, have been discussed in the press, and I believe, and this has been also expressed by a number of officials here, that those criticisms were hugely unfair, because the United Arab Emirates, almost alone amongst countries in the region, have already passed into law the legislation that would enable the humane treatment of labor and their conditions of living and their conditions of payment. And this has been recognized by the relevant United Nations organizations. For the workers on Saadiyat, there's a village that has been constructed that offers the highest levels of convenience and comfort of living for the laborers working on the island. Now, no government in the world and no country in the world is perfect, and when you are working in a period of rapid development, there are always people who try to exploit labor, or who try to exploit economically others. And the role of government, and this is something that the government of the United Arab Emirates is very conscious about, is to make sure that they have the legislation and that they implement that legislation. So I would say that on this record, the United Arab Emirates truly does not have anything to hide.
Thank you. Yes. This last question, and then we need to close this out. And there was a hand there, and that's it.
Hello, my name is Haya, and I'm a student of architecture. I have a question about the issue of sustainability has been highly considered in the past, in the recent architectural projects here in Abu Dhabi. Has that at all affected the design of the museum or the choice of materials?
What was the first
The
part?
first part of the question was not clear.
Sustainability.
Sustainability. And sustainable issues, right? Yeah.
Well, sustainability is one of the most important issues facing our world. There's all kinds of ways to deal with it, and certainly it's part of our design process. We have consultants monitoring all of those facets of the construction and the design as we go. But let me tell you that the construction industry globally is 30% waste. 30%. It's a lot of waste that adds to the issues of wasting our planet. And it's not a big issue that's been addressed, and we're addressing that as part of our process, and by clarifying the drawings and making them precise, so there's eliminating of as many change orders and inconsistencies in the evolution, and as well as all of the other issues of sustainability, the solutions that are on the table now. Some of them are not as successful as we've been told, And we have to be very careful that we're not wasting effort just to get a certification of some kind, that we're really doing something that's really, really contributing to saving our planet. So that's very much a priority.
I think we have come to that time to close this out. I hope that you have really appreciated our distinguished panelists, their aspirations, their expectations, and their hopes for the new Abu Dhabi Guggenheim. Please join me in welcoming and thanking our panelists.